let's get going. And welcome to everyone who's on Zoom too. Thank you for rejoining. I just sort of want to, just to kick this off, say something which was something that was very interesting in the last session, and I, in my closing comments, failed to just flag it, which was in this last session, everything we heard was a perfect segue to repair, because I mean, we were talking about the conservation of 20th century architecture. We were talking about attitudes to buildings, and it's a wonderful segue to this. And well, I suppose an unintentional, but a kind of implicit continuity we had even imagined, but not so clearly as the last few questions surfaced it. So very much look forward to this. And Ajmal and the others should just follow Ajmal, and then we'll have a discussion with Snehanshu and Anisha, who I think are here, but they might be just coming after lunch. Good.
Good afternoon, everyone. Colleagues have very deftly removed the footstool. Otherwise, some of you may not have been able to see the presentation, in fact. And also, it's always a hard act to follow lunch, so I hope I don't put you to sleep. I'll try not to, of course. The benefit of giving instruction is that you also take good instruction. And so I'll be sure to mind the time. But I would like to acknowledge, of course, the generosity of Raul and colleagues for organizing this conference, which I think is very pertinent and relevant to the work, certainly, that we do in Afghanistan. Let's move on to the first slide. So I work for the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. The Aga Khan Trust for Culture is an agency of the Aga Khan Development Network, which is a philanthropic entity working in many of the countries in South Asia and across the ways into the Middle East and also West and East Africa. The Trust for Culture is one of the key pillars, one of three within the Aga Khan Development Network, focusing on economic development, social development, and cultural development. And within the Trust for Culture, we have the Historic Cities Program, the Aga Khan Architecture Award that you know very well, the music program, and also a museums program, which is quite active. And following that notion of the Historic Cities Program, which we represent at the Trust for Culture in Afghanistan, and also the diversity of cultural intervention or interventions in the cultural sector, I think when we talk about frameworks and practices, I would describe our work in Afghanistan both as a framework and as a practice in the very traditional sense, an architectural practice. So the work we've done is essentially conservation, but also in the context of this afternoon's talk, repair, what I would like to also term as updating the past. I think in that context, we've done a number of projects, more than 150, in fact, over the last 20 years. And the priority for us, of course, has been public spaces, spaces for Afghans after decades of conflict to be able to come together. Conflict has a tendency, and I don't think this is specific to Afghanistan, to alienate people, to tear people apart from each other. So these public spaces actually have had the reverse effect of bringing people together. I'll bend over a bit more. And for the purposes, again, of this presentation, I've had to be quite selective about which project I wanted to present. But I would like to say, with respect to this morning's session and again, tomorrow's sessions, the work that we do could easily have been adjusted to be presentable in each one of these formats because of the nature of it, the nature of the fact that we don't generally work within an established structure. The state mechanisms, regulatory systems are so weak that we are given quite a bit of leeway in our work. And as such, we go back to what was discussed in the last session, responsibility. We have a lot of responsibility that we put upon ourselves for the quality and the scope of work that we do. So the site I'd like to present, one of three today, is what we call the Mashinkhana Industrial Complex. And this is what you see here in the foreground, of course, a series of industrial warehouses and spaces. Again, the general context of the work we do in Afghanistan, of course, restoration, as well as rehabilitation of historic monuments across the country, and also public gardens and public sites. This is just some quick statistics on the figures of how much, Afghanistan has been the focus of quite a lot of investment, and some of that also in the cultural sector. And again, the key projects that I would have left out from today's discussion. But the Mashinkhana industrial site, here we are. And this notion of buildings that are in the periphery of a growing and expanding city through history, but that eventually become at the center of the city. And that then forces another look at programmatic aspects. This was a munitions factory. In fact, Afghanistan's first armaments factory established in the 19th century. And today it's been converted. In fact, we've restored it, we modernized it, rehabilitated it into a public space. The general visioning of the placing a project like this, which is now in the urban context, within the wider notion of creating public space, creating civic space, and creating linkages between the different communities. Also, these renderings, cross-sectional renderings of before and after the project, and what the aim of the project was really to work within the communities, informal communities in the hillside, to regulate and inform the space within the Mashikhana complex, and also then to create civic space for interaction of people. This is how the space was being used. Again, a militarized site in the center of a 4.5 million populated city presented many challenges, particularly in the last 2 decades. And after this site was vacated by our project, then of course doing a lot of building archaeology to understand the original nature of the site. And also you can see some of the damage that had been, that took place over the conflict, which was an urban conflict in many ways. And also the potential, the spaces, and to look at how to reuse these vacated cavernous spaces in a program that could be relevant for people even today was quite an important aspect of the project. And so these are more recent photographs, of course, after 4 years of conservation and also of insertion of programming. In this context, of course, what was important, what was the monument was the shell of the hangars or the warehouses, and what could be done in terms of program was to insert programs like islands within the space itself. And again, you can see the conversion of the program. This is always not so easy to convert an existing building that has a certain amount of function or has been purposefully built for a specific function into something which then can be relevant to communities and to people and to the city. And also selectively looking at the repertoire of architecture, of materiality, of form, of technique, and extruding from that something which can be also quite contemporary in the context of the historic environment or the warehouses themselves. Also building the workforce to do this work. One of the particular advantages of working in Afghanistan, perhaps disadvantages, is that architects tend to work in an environment and an industry that caters to architecture, which means many things are mass produced, many things are produced in a different environment, whereas that's not what happens in Afghanistan. All the building blocks and all the building pieces have to be built by the teams that do the work. And in this instance, through ourselves and the workshops and the people that we work with. And also the creation then of external space to look at commerce. Mobile vendors is one of the major obstacles within the city. So these canopied external areas are meant to regularize commercial activities, low-scale commercial activities. Demolition. I don't think preservation or in fact urban rehabilitation or regeneration can proceed without demolition, especially in a context where a large amount of money has been injected over a very short period of time and has led to speculative growth, unregulated growth. So in this instance, says the demolition of quite a large ad hoc wedding hall, which was blocking a key area or intersection of the project. This is about a year into the project, and this is at the moment what we speak. This is the second project, and the reason I show this is because of the restrictions that we face in our work significantly. Because we work in historic sites, and in this case, an archaeological site, it means that we don't have the liberty to do as we want when we want to insert new programs to enable visitors to come to something like this. This is the historic citadel of Kabul, and what we've built in the foreground, what we've rehabilitated in the foreground, is an old underground bunker that's used to store munitions, rockets, long-range rockets, in fact. And you can see the sequential images on the right of how that space was excavated, how it was repaired, how it was expanded to a limited degree. And these are some of the internal images of the transformation before and then after, of course. And this is now a site museum. This is where all the archaeological elements and evidence that will be gathered. Much has been, and the rest that will be gathered through the through ongoing archaeological excavations will be displayed for the public. And again, the reuse of the metal casings, which once had contained munitions and armaments. And of course, the architectural model of the site and how it's configured. The other project, of course, is the Chilsatun Gardens, which is a public garden. You can see the sequential images from 2004 to 2018 when we finished the work. And what that entailed is the return of a public space, the return of a public garden to communities. And we've had, in this garden and other projects, we've had more than 11 million visitors in the last 20 years. So it's a very popular place for people to congregate, for people to come, also to establish a connection and relationship with nature, but also with each other. And the transformations, of course, which to a large degree looks at what's existing and inserting then selective elements and updating the significance of a building that previously was used for essentially a palace and now is used for public functions. And the selective insertion of modern architecture, contemporary architecture that can provide facilities and services and meeting the new needs and requirements of people. And then, of course, the use of such spaces. You can see the Mashinkhana complex in the middle ground there, but these buildings and sites are usually embedded in a big fabric of residential areas and also in communities that are some of the poorest in Kabul. And so work directly in these communities to upgrade, to identify and upgrade their basic infrastructure, access, and also the creation of what we call hanging gardens or level space within the hillsides where people can congregate and use. So what you see here on the foreground and on the left. And again, the building of capacity, it's one of the most important things. 40 years of continuous conflict has meant that many of the educated classes, many of the professional classes have left Afghanistan. And so 20 years, I would say, is the beginning of a time to work on building capacity, local technical capacity. And also then the skilled workforce that works on these projects and continues to work on these projects, both in the field and in the classroom and on training programs. Thank you.
I think I'm coming down on size, not only in height, but yes. Thank you. It's good. Well, first of all, thank you, Rahul and the team for inviting me to be part of this wonderful, wonderful discussion. And I'm particularly excited on this topic of repair, especially of everyday architecture that was initiated by Rahul and then articulated critically by Anisha and Snehanshu. Yeah, okay. I would like to start with the concept of repair that I've studied, learned, and experienced in my work, and at times struggled with, and follow it up with some examples of how I applied it in the cases of Bandipur in Nepal. In today's rapidly transforming and ephemeral world, repair is not pretty or glamorous for social media postings that have become ingrained in our daily lives, whether we like it or not. It is also seen as tedious and time-consuming when newer and shinier replacements are available with a flick of our fingers in our hands wherever we are. Repair, whether buildings, objects, clothes, relationships, or even society at large requires careful thought and is specific to a particular object or instant. It needs skills and patience that may not be instantly downloaded from the myriad templates available for new replacements or new constructions. It is also not advertised or marketed by vendors constantly and insistently in every form of media, from social media to telemarketing to television to hoarding boards, giving the sense that repair is exclusive, elite, and maybe more expensive than new builds or replacements. Or it is not worthy of spending time and money on, or perhaps even an embarrassment that one cannot afford a new building and is repairing just for temporarily. It lacks the newness value that society aspires for, especially when they're spending some money on it and hoping for an upgrade. The notion has been compounded by the international interest and funding in the restoration of monuments and reuse of heritage buildings as boutique hotels or museums. We are not taking time to learn, to repair or learn about traditional methods and traditions, preferring new, which is often taken as technologically more advanced and innovative solutions. We have also lost the practice of maintenance. Why would anyone restore or paint their houses? Houses are just to spend the night. This is the response of one of my interviewees for the research I was doing on the perception of landscape aesthetics. But this simple statement made me reassess my own perceptions of what a village or city should look like or mean for a wider audience. Why would or should we repair, maintain everyday architecture that makes the bulk of the built environment? In small villages such as Bandipur, a hilltop town in Nepal between the capital Kathmandu and the popular tourist destination of Pokhara, it may be because of economic benefits, or in other words, tourism. A thriving trading town between the northern hills and the southern plains until the mid-20th century. It lost its prominence in the 1960s when the southern plains were opened up after malaria was eradicated. A new highway was built bypassing the highway was built along the river, bypassing the hilltop towns, and the district headquarters moved to a more convenient highway town. We revived this town in 2005, 2006, focusing on conserving the built heritage through tourism promotion. The main bazaar, as you see now, is preserved today as a picturesque town, popular with international tourists as a quiet town that has banned vehicles, including motorbikes in the main bazaar, and domestic tourists for filming music videos and video blogs and such. One of the first buildings we worked on is the current Hotel Gaonkar. It was a residence that had been abandoned and was falling apart. The house belonged to a prominent family with more than 15 owners. In Nepal, ancestral properties are usually passed down to the sons. This property had not been officially handed down or willed to a particular family member, so all male members, more than 15, had a stake on it. This complication probably saved the building from being demolished or sold. One member of the same family leased it from the other members for 20 years and restored it and converted into a hotel. Our objective with this building was to use this work an example of repairing a traditional building that would save the built environment and give it a new use that would provide some economic incentive to the owners. We also wanted to set an example of proper conservation work, respecting the original material, style, construction technology, even workers, as much as possible. The clients also agreed with us as they were planning to promote it as a boutique hotel where the guests would experience the authentic village life. This work included repairing what was broken and replacing what was lost, using the same materials as much as possible. Of course, plumbing and electricity was added and upgraded with an additional floor as well, and as required by its new use. We are lucky to work with a lead carpenter whose father was one of the original builders. Once completed, the building functioned very well in its new use, and at one time was one of the most expensive guest houses in Bandipur, but it did not look new. Another project, a simpler two-story residence with a tea shop on the ground floor, was again converted. This is more recent, into a guest house. This time we added a story as well as a balcony and some decorative elements, as you can see with the niches. And the balcony is a distinctive character of Bandipur Bazaar. Most houses facing south have balconies on the first floor that shares the ground floor, the shops in the ground floor, and creates kind of a nice walkway, shaded walkway. We also added some decorative elements. It was mostly for lighting purposes. These additional elements have become quite popular with the locals, and with quite a few new buildings copying them, sometimes with good results and sometimes missing a mark completely. So in the first example, we followed the more conventional path, focusing on repairing and reusing as much as possible with traditional materials and methods. There are very few decorations and alterations. We even maintained the original mud floor, which turned out to be too difficult to maintain in its new use as a hotel, so had been replaced since with traditional ceramic tiles. In the second example, though, we added a few decorations to highlight the building, which has been more widely accepted and copied, especially the balcony and the niches. Balconies the balconies are traditional and had been removed or changed when the businesses moved away from Bandipur, and they have been replaced now, which is actually a good thing. But as I said, the balcony is a common Bandipur architecture, so I think that's fine, and it fits in with the rest of the buildings. But the niches and the decorative elements have, kind of taken off with even the new constructions copying them. So as an architect, we have realized that we have to be careful on what we design and the innovations that we want to be copied as such. So, but this transformation in Bandipur is not just about the building. It has been possible to, of course, like I said before, through tourism. One of the other major interventions that we did that helped the revival of Bandipur was the repair of the main bazaar. The original stone paving had been destroyed when the vehicular road connected Bandipur to the highway. When we first worked here in 2005, it was either muddy or in the wet seasons or dusty in the dry seasons, with diesel buses starting up at 5 a.m. to be ready at 7 a.m. or that's what I felt. So it felt like. So it was either muddy or dusty and very polluted, with shops all not opening up to the bazaar, and the bazaar dominated by vehicles, mostly local buses and delivery trucks. With the repaving and banning of motorized vehicles, the bazaar today is enjoyed by a wider group. The shops and the houses have opened up to the bazaar. It is a quiet place for a tourist to rest and relax, enjoying the local life revolving around them. It is a clean and healthy space for all, for the elderly to socialize and the children to play. The repair of the pavement has repaired more than the physical fab structure. It has repaired the society to come together to maintain the bazaar and the houses. When we repaired the bazaar, we provided the material and the technical assistance. The residents were responsible for the work supervision. For the part of the bazaar that was in front of their own houses, this ensured that they were involved to see that the paving was done well in from their houses, and this local investment also ensured the continued maintenance, including cleanliness, which is one of the common observations of visitors to Bandipur. The repair of public space, the bazaar promoted Bandipur as a tourist destination. We repaired a few buildings as examples, but once tourists started coming, the residents started repairing and maintaining their houses, albeit for tourism purposes. Economy certainly plays an important part in the process of revival, be it everyday architecture or bigger cities and towns. Bandipur has declared the bazaar and the surrounding 500 meters a preserved area. This has its own issues, but we'll not get into that today. But this declaration is important because it was proposed by the local community as they started to understand the value of their vernacular architecture. While most of the other preserved areas in Nepal, especially in Kathmandu Valley, are decided by the central government without any correspondence or any communication with the people. In conclusion, repair and reuse of everyday architecture, mainly that have traditional architectural values, are getting some attention in Nepal. However, this is mainly driven by tourism and adapted as guest houses in the niche boutique market. There are a few examples where owner continues to live in the traditional house after restoration. Currently, we are working on one of the owners, one of the restoration of one building that the owner's brief for us was that his house should be repaired, restored, upgraded, adapted in such a way that his son doesn't have to repair it in his lifetime. Or the house will be at least preserved for another, protected and preserved for another generation. I believe that repair will gain value and prominence with the future generation as the climate change issue becomes critical. Repair and adaptation of the existing housing stock is the most significant sustainable approach that we can take into consideration the cost of the environment when we demolish and rebuild, including the disposal of materials such as concrete that uses too much energy to reuse. Thank you.
Just click that. Thank you so much. First, Rahul, I have to thank you so much for this podium. Yeah, I was just wondering how to peer over the podium here. Good afternoon, everybody. Unlike Ajmal, just as I said, I'm much shorter than him, so I need the podium here. It's such a pleasure to be here among all esteemed scholars and architects. Thank you so much, Rahul, and your team for organizing this and inviting us Bhutanese. This is, of course, my first time here for this South Asian Institute conference. And also thank you to Lakshmi Mittal Institute and their team. Everything was organized so brilliantly. I was just telling Anushka that. As requested by our moderators, I would like to first start off with what repair means to me, because that is what they asked us to do. And I was thinking that I should go along with what they've asked us to do for our presentation. So for me, repair in my journey of 30 years of my career goes beyond mere physical fixing. It's been a multifaceted, interconnected dimensions of many, many different layers of people and also social connections. For me, repair is also a very transformative force. It's renewal, it's breathing new life. And it's, for me, the most inherently sustainable way of building, more so than what we have young architects doing in terms of creating green buildings. And for me, repair is also very economically viable alternative to new construction, especially in South Asia, I feel, and especially in Bhutan in our rural areas. And beyond that, in South Asia, as we discussed before, the most important thing, especially in Bhutan, is cultural continuity and identity, and especially for us, a little country between the giants, India and China, that is one of the most important ways of kind of reinforcing who we are. And beyond that, I would like to really stress that repair is something I was just discussing with a colleague just before this presentation, that I've actually never really used the word repair before. I've always used the word conservation or restoration or preservation even. And to have repair, I would like to thank Rahul for bringing that into my vocabulary. And I would like to see that also being expressed, especially in our architectural institutions, because a lot of the studios I remember, and especially I have been a jury to some of our institutions, and we've seen basically only new construction and new designs being impressed by our esteemed professors to our students. So repair never really is something that you see in a studio, unless, of course, you specialize in and go for a master's course. So I would really like to see that, especially if you want to reduce the ecological footprint. I feel that's very important. There's no point saying that, oh, I'm a very green, sustainable architect, and then you go on designing new things, because the most inherently sustainable thing is to repair something, just as you recycle your bottles or your clothes or your garbage. So I would like to really see that being expressed in our institutions. So for us in Bhutan, I don't know if you've heard that, but gross national happiness is so important. It's something that we followed since the 1970s. It's the way we look at every project in the government. Everything that is publicly funded has to go through that to see whether whatever we do instills happiness and well-being in our citizens. And as a small country, of course, it is possible for us to do that. And within repair, I feel that it is a very good response to the GNH 4 pillars that we follow, which looks at sustainability, continuity and identity, economic viability, and social equity. So whatever projects we've done, and especially in my journey, in my career, I've always looked at that. GNH has been my guiding principle. And I know that with a lot of our younger architects and citizens in Bhutan, sometimes they get a little jaded with GNH. But for me, that has been my guiding principle. And I've always felt that whatever I've done guided by that has been successful till now. And I hope it'll continue. Now, I've been asked to express my evolution, my journey of repair in Bhutan. And again, I'm following to the T what the moderators asked me to do. One of the projects in my 20s, the first project that my journey began with in terms of repair was the restoration of the Tiger's Nest Monastery in Paro. I was just in my 20s and I joined the government and tried to found the first office for conservation of heritage sites in the government. And it's been 30 years since then. So this is a picture of what it used to look like before. And it was taken in the 18th century by a British man who visited Bhutan. One of the very few old photographs that we have. You can see that we had shingle roofs back then. So when I joined the government, 2 years later, it was totally damaged by a fire in 1998. And I was lucky enough to be there. And for some reason, when I finished my architectural studies, I decided instead of going to the Ministry of Infrastructure or Human Settlements to join the Department of Culture. And this was my first project that I suddenly was asked to do, even though I was just a skinny 20-year-old, especially because there were no other architects then. We were one of the first few architects. And the first thing we did, because for us in conservation, the first thing is to continue the practices there, not just the physical aspect of it. So the first thing we did was, you can see how we built a little structure there, and that was for the monks to continue their prayers and for whatever practices were going on there before to continue. So that was the first thing we did, even before we looked at documentation. And when it came to documentation, now one of the biggest problems I had and our office had was there were no drawings, there were no photographs. So we literally send an SOS around the world. If you visited Taktsang and you have any photographs, could you share it with us? And I had only visited it once before when I was a teenager. And a lot of my team members also had never really visited. And what we decided when we started the restoration was that we would do it in a way that was done how it was done before. We had a lot of people from around the world. It was even in the newspaper in New York Times saying that oh, this is a monument that needs to be restored. And we had teams from Japan, teams from America, teams from the Netherlands asking to be part of this project. But our office decided that it should be a project that is only done by locals, so that we have continued pride in it, and rather than saying that, oh, it is restored by a Japanese team. So that was the first things we did. And we formed a team of carpenters, masons, traditional artists, and we worked with them. So my journey for restoration, I felt was more, instead of being an architect, I suddenly became a student again. And for this work, the first thing I did, because I was a woman working with a lot of men, and it was the first time as a female you were allowed to work with the temple. So I tried very hard to immerse myself into their culture. So even though we had a lot of drawings, we had BOQs, I never took them to site. We built a little model for them to see how things were. And then we always had discussions on site. So my intention was not to make them feel that, oh, you have this wonderful head carpenter who's worked for 30 years and you have this skinny little girl coming in and with some drawings and making him feel uncomfortable about it. So that's what we did. So the entire project took 5 years. The only technological material that we used was the cable cranes that took the materials up. We prefabricated a lot of things down, especially because, as you can see, the site is a little bit risky. It's you have to walk for 2 hours to get there. And in my 5 years of working on that project, you can believe it, I was one of the fittest people in Taimur. Yeah. So I would like to again stress about the wonderful people I worked with. I learned a lot from them, and my journey and appreciation of traditional architecture and craftsmen began with them. Unfortunately, a few of them have passed on, and you can see how a lot of the tools we use are very traditional. Even the one where you can see a man making the hole with that tool, we made it a point to use some of things like that. And then moving on from that project, I had the pleasure and honor to work in a lot of different projects, including some big stupas, some fortresses, some 17th century monasteries, and also a monastery that we later turned into a school, which is the Simta Kazan. And these are just a few examples, but my journey, as I said, first began with just looking at restoration and repair of monuments, and that was what the government was about. So as I was discussing with a fellow architect, I was invited as a Loeb Fellow to Harvard in 2008. And when I went there, suddenly I realized that there were many ways to look at restoration and not just monumental architecture, but that was the way things were in Bhutan. So I resigned from the government and decided to start my own practice. And now in this practice, we've decided to move on to the more mundane category, the third category of repair mundane buildings. And I'd like to show you our version of modern buildings that were built in the 1970s and 80s. You can see this town, it's a picture that I took in 2015, some of the oldest urban buildings, just 3 stories. And I did a project, I managed to convince one of the richest families not to tear down the building. And this is the building that we managed to convince them, but they wanted it to be viable. So what it was a project that is a little different from preservation and restoration. So what I did was what we call the architectural plastic surgery, so how to revive something. So looking at it, in some ways, as somebody who studied conservation, it did make me a little uncomfortable, but I looked at this more in terms of reducing my ecological footprint. How can you revive old buildings instead of tearing them down? Because if you look at this building in the corner on the side, you can see how it was torn down, and then you have a big concrete hotel here. So that was what was going to happen to the other buildings. So we managed to convince them. And if you look at how it was and then the repair, and I was very happy to go and see it recently to find a lot of young people there, because when I first went in, it was basically a place where school children went to smoke and hide and do all sorts of things. So then now it's a more vibrant place. So the plastic surgery kind of worked to revive things and attract people more. Then moving on to my last conclusion, for me, I feel repair has to stop being reactive to failures and fixing things and to be more proactive. And as I said, that is what I see should be more and more introduced into institutions where you have studios that focus not just on new designs and trying to be this architect that comes up with something that's never been done, but having studios that look at repairs and proactive, innovative, something to be proud of. And hopefully somebody who does that will one day win the Pritzker Prize instead of only architects that do new designs. That's one of my dreams. So with that, I thank you very much. And I thank the moderators for giving me ideas on how to do.
Thank you very much.
Taimur, you can start.
All right, thanks a lot. I'd like to start by thanking Rahul for this opportunity to meet with all of you. This presentation intends to address via the medium of our work one of the core concerns of this conference, the connection between theory and practice. Which in our view are not separable. The presentation has two parts. The first presents a theoretical background for our work, and the second, a sampling of projects. We describe our work as continuing tradition because for us, tradition is a living reality, which needs to be understood, theory, believed in one's heart, and lived through one's practice. The Quran says, wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God. But when we look around, we see only things. The purpose and aim of tradition, traditional art and architecture, in fact, of all traditional civilization, is to reinstate this lost vision of the face of God in things. You could also call it the face of Krishna. A vision which sees through the veil of things to the timeless reality beyond. Tradition aims to regain this vision through its wisdom teachings, which include a theoretical framework or metaphysical doctrine and a spiritual practice. One of the means of combining the two in this transformation of vision is through the practice of traditional art and architecture. That is, combining metaphysical doctrine and spiritual practice through the arts. Traditional art serves both as a support for spiritual practice and as a reminder, reflection, and expression of this sought-after vision. In the Perso-Islamic cultural sphere, this concept of art is designated by the terms majaz or haqiqat. As expressed in this line of Urdu poetry, kabhi hai haqiqat muntazar nazara libase majaz mein. Here majaz means symbol or form, while haqiqat means reality or essence. The scenario just described is enough reason for the practice of tradition. But I would now add why such practice is not really a choice, but a necessity in our reading of today's context. The worldview previously described, defining the nature of the world and the place and purpose of mankind within it, was shattered, discredited, and overturned by the coming of Western modernity and its accompanying reductionist or scientific worldview. Which reduced the world to matter. Once the world was reduced to matter alone and man to his body and desires, the stage was set for the indiscriminate plunder of the earth's resources to fulfill the limitless greed of the powerful through the creation of unlimited wants. The end result is the catastrophic disbalance of the earth's ecosystem and the denaturing of the human being. Thus, turning to mankind's timeless wisdom traditions and the accompanying practices is not a sentimental fetishizing of tradition, but arguably the only way forward to sanity and fulfillment of the individual and society, and the aversion of certain destruction for the world. In this evaluation of the current situation, we see our work not as a return to the past, but as a reawakening to the ever-present reality. With this introduction, I'll now turn to our work. I now present some of our work, 3 projects, and also try to show why this section is titled Practice of Tradition, Combining Theory and Practice. In this, one of the timeless tools is the traditional grammar of architecture, which really underlies the very special and timeless quality we find in traditional architecture, which governs the plan, the elevations, the sections, and it has limitless potential within it. I mean, there's no constraint. And within this grammar lie the methods of design. And the essence of these methods, I would say, is proportion, essentially geometric proportion, which has always, since millennia, been combined with modular proportion. And this is a building in the Taj Mahal complex from Eva Koch's book on the complete Taj. This is Babar laying out a garden with his architect holding a drawing board. Learning from the masters, Ustad Muhammad Siddiq Glotar notebook with drawings from 1922 to 1964. Ustad Rahim Bakhsh of Multan, who worked on the Aga Khan award-winning restoration conservation project of the 14th century tomb of Shah Rukn-e-Alam. This is one of his drawings from the 1970s, which I call an essay on proportion. And then my own Ustad, whom I had, this is a drawing by him, Ustad Haji Abdul Aziz, with whom I had the privilege of being his student for nearly 3 years. Here he talks about his concept, or the traditional concept, of proportionality, and then his discussion of creativity within a larger metaphysical framework. Now, whenever we do a project, we do precedent study of the relevant historical models. In this case, we did a survey of the mosques of Lahore and then focused on these mid-sized Shah Jahan period mosques of Lahore, and there were many others. And from this, we synthesized our own design. So once we understood what this typology contained and the variations and so on, the construction used no Portland cement, no concrete, no steel, just bricks and a mixture of limes and cut brickwork, handmade traditional glazed tiles, and molded terracotta as well. And the people, Ustad Rafaqat and his apprentices, Ustad Jafar and his apprentice, Ustad Siddiq, our interns, architects, and young hereditary mason from Multan, Sultan, who made this Mukarnas from our drawings. Manuscript illuminator and calligrapher. These are the side domes. These are designed for the side domes. Then a gilder for the gold leafing and the fresco artists. In the central dome, I gave the model and the client gave the names of God which were to go on it. And Ustad Jafar really knew how to put the geometry on the dome and then the interior was a collaboration with Ustad Rafaqat, the fresco painter, and myself. I'll move on to our second project, which is a completely different program, a completely different location, metropolitan coastal city of Karachi, in a slum primary health clinic, which we were supposed to join two slum houses, which also had shops and so on, and to remodel it into a low-cost, climate-friendly clinic. Tried to retain as much of the old structure as possible and use whatever was available in Karachi, which is very rich in molded and industrially produced also concrete and cement elements. And we also used the existing doors and some doors from the local kabadia, which turned out to be a teak door. Bombay tiles, as they're called, pressed cement tiles. And in the end, or the third project is a recently finished residential. It's a house. And the team here is completely different. It's a different set of craftsmen, a different contractor. And then I'll conclude by introducing Hastanist Institute of Traditional Studies and Arts, with which I'm attached, which consists of 5 centers: a center for the arts, including miniature painting, fresco, illumination, music, classical music, and such things. And a center of languages, named after the great Sanskrit grammarian Panini, who was from near Rawalpindi in Taxila. A center of metaphysics and philosophy, and a center of history and cultural studies, named after Al-Biruni, the author of the Kitabul Hind, Tarikhul Hind, 10th century, and a center finally of architecture, named after Ustad Ahmad Nimar Lohri, who was from Lahore, Shah Jahan's chief architect, who probably designed the Taj Mahal, along with a big team of other designers, obviously. And so through our teaching, we are proud to say that now there's a team of young architects. The building behind us is being constructed by one of my students on the left, Bilal, and two master craftsmen, their team. And on the right, two of my students who now joined our firm, and another one who's at the moment enrolled in one of our courses and also an intern at the firm. So with this, thank you very much.
Thank you, Taimur. We are going to do the panel discussion and you'll be on, so we see you. And I'll WhatsApp you some images of what the audience looks like. Can I be heard?
Hello, hello. It's working. Yeah. Thank you. Technologically challenged. So a big thank you to all the presenters, including Taimur, who unfortunately can't be here in person, but we can see him quite clearly on the screen. And I, for one, was, trying to take my notes, and also my head was buzzing with all the ideas that all these speakers have at least put into my heads. I don't know about the people sitting here in the hall, but it's been a very exhilarating session. Thank you so much. And what I'll do is to, before I hand the mic over to Anisha, I just sort of try and connect all the speakers through maybe a question. So what we saw was that starting with Ajmal's presentation, which was the more traditional conservation sort of a project, but which definitely, like a lot of the Arkan programs, reaches out to the community and works with them, includes them. It just doesn't remain just a making of a museum. And that, brings me to Jharna's presentation, which is that, yes, you can turn a conservation project into a regular repair project. But as you very correctly pointed out, that, it is still possible only when there is a commercial angle. I mean, we're not talking about a state-funded restoration or repair, but where the people get involved simply because they see there is money in it, to put it very crudely. And in the case of Bhutan, of course, Dorji's case, the first project you worked upon was, to me, the most interesting. But I was very curious to know about this plastic surgery you spoke of, because you didn't expand on it. But if I were to guess, I would say, is it something like what Carlos Scarpa attempted in Italy, where he kind of, did restoration, but not strictly a conservation restoration to make the place more usable? And in Taimur's case, of course, a very fascinating presentation, because, as you know, Anisha and I have similar thoughts, but we wouldn't put it so clearly, maybe, as you did. But what I want to link to Taimur's thing and to all of your thing, my first question really is that how much of an impact does your effort I wouldn't even say your work, your effort in trying to get more people involved in this process of quote unquote repair, which is not just conservation. That's one. And the other question, which is sort of more prosaic from my side, is that the way Taimur talked about this whole system of proportions, which was the backbone of any traditional architecture, in your own work, that is, I'm addressing the other three panelists, is that something that you also had to develop along with the master craftsmen that they knew? And I think I will not carry on asking questions because maybe I'll run out of, I mean, Anisha ran out of questions, so I'll just pass the phone on to her.
So I'll just begin by thanking all the panelists, all the presenters, because it makes me so happy to see the kind of work that's happening in South Asia. And I think what I'll do is that what would be good is if you would like to answer what Snehanshu's asked before we forget, and then I'll come back to my observations.
Do you want Taimur to start? Because he's not here for categories. As you wish. Whichever way you like.
I can start.
Yes, please.
With regard to whether we have other people interested, definitely in Bhutan. I can't speak for the other countries, but in Bhutan, because of the way the cultural context is so important, we do have a lot of people, young people interested, and we have schools which we call the Zorik Chusum Traditional Arts and Crafts Schools that the government fully funds and sponsors. It is something that is very much alive and hopefully will still be alive. And with regard to the plastic surgery, architectural plastic surgery, it is just a term because when I worked with those clients, and that building was a building that was built in the 1970s, and the owner happened to be the previous foreign minister, one of the richest families in Thimphu, and the other buildings around were getting dismantled and they were building new buildings. So this was a building where we managed to, it was a relative of mine, friend. So we managed to discuss with him how we could revive the building and not inherently look at it as how you would look at monuments, but to give it new life. And I feel repair is basically that. It's to give new life, to readapt, to revive, and to make sure that the building is something that is still viable and is still functional, and not just a relic you visit as a museum. And in Bhutan, that is something that we very much appreciate, because a lot of the buildings, even if they're conservation monuments, are still used. They're not really museums. You still have people living in them, people studying in them, people working in them. So that was something that we discussed with the clients. And even though we gave it plastic surgery, we really didn't go back to making it look young, because the way we did the design was something that we picked up from one of the old palaces. But what happened was it brought in more light. The previous building that was built in the 1980s had very small windows. There was no light. It was very dingy inside. And all the new buildings had these shiny glass facades and looked much more modern. So that's what we tried to do. We tried to make sure that we still use traditional craftspeople in making the windows, the timber elements, but brought in a lot of more light. And now some of the most expensive and the most visited cafes decided that they'd become tenants there. So as soon as we finished the restoration, he got 3 of the most expensive cafes moving in, and he was able to make it a commercial success. So that plastic surgery basically is just a term we used in jest.
Good.
Yes.
Yeah, so under the rubric of repair, I think it covers everything. I mean, as long as we're not talking about tabula rasa, flat ground that you're building something new, everything else falls under the overall rubric of repair. In the analogy of medical terms, I would say plastic surgery, open heart surgery, amputations, reattaching limbs, and perhaps even reviving the dead. I've seen that today as well. So from that perspective, I think context is important. And I come from a very, very specific context where it's decades of conflict, decades of war, decades of destruction, not only of the physical environment, not only of the historic environment, but of the social order, if you want. And in that context, what I would say is some of the most historic areas are where the poorest live. And when we talk about educating, I mean, without patronizing, the poor have perhaps more aspirations than the rich. I would argue that. And within that context of aspiration, within that context of need, I think one strikes a balance, tries to strike a balance between repair. The certain thing that I could say is that none of the buildings, and dozens of buildings that we've restored, have remained empty and unused. In Afghanistan, we don't talk about tourist monuments. I mean, tourism doesn't exist, or at least, international tourism in that way doesn't exist. So these are buildings that are integral to communities, whether they pray in them, whether they live in them, whether they worship in them, whether they, for hygiene purposes, or parks, gardens, other places where they gather. These are spaces important to communities, but to transfer the importance of historic monuments to communities is not easy. I know one of the easiest ways is to make it important for them, right? And then, of course, maintenance and repair and all of that requires resources and, the stigmas associated with living in the old, the aspirations of wanting to move to the new. One of the reasons why the poorest communities live in these areas is because the rich have moved out. And so I just know there's not one way to do all of it. It has it's specific to the context, it's specific to the aspiration, it's specific to what's possible within that context. But to not take no for an answer, and also to be responsible, I think is critical.
Yes, I mean, very well said. And that example for the example of Bandipur, when we're talking more about small residences of normal people, economy becomes a very big part. And the other thing we've also felt is like, the first example I showed you is like we started working there like 2005, 2006, and now it's been almost 20 years. At the beginning, we had some funding from the European Commission, but more than that, the impact now is like we've been going back continuously on our own, like voluntarily, talking to people, trying to convince them. When we first started working there, when we asked the local what was the most beautiful thing about Bandipur, they used to say like, oh, the view, the mountain view. I mean, you can get mountain views from anywhere in Nepal. But they did not appreciate the buildings. And that quote I showed you, that was the turning point in my thesis, actually. One of the turning points in my thesis, like, I went there, we would go there, like look at the building and admire them. And for them, it was like, it's just a place we go and sleep. That was quite a eye opener. So, but I think it was a continuous effort that not just us, but other people as well, like trying to convince them, work with them. And that was also, I have to say, that was also a time when Nepal also was going through internal conflict. So there was no tourists when we first started working. Luckily, 2006, we had the peace agreement. So people start moving out, even Nepalese people start going around. So that was also changed. So, you do all the work and then no one comes and visits, like what to do about it. But it was a good, lucky for us as well. So I think it's for some places, like the most important thing is continued work. And for that, of course, the local community is very, very important to get them engaged as much as possible and listen to them. You just listen to them.
Yeah. So Taimur is.
Hello, it's very nice to see both Anisha and Snehanshu, whom I met many, many years ago in Leicester. So it's a lovely opportunity. I think I will try to answer two of your questions. One was about proportion, and the other was about impact. I mean, we do what we do because we think that needs to be done without any concern for impact or not. I mean, we can't destroy our own planet. We can't destroy our own humanity. We can't do inappropriate interventions into our built environment. That just goes without saying. It's just common sense. So, and obviously our clients more often than not love what we produce, and it is comfortable, it's homely, it has, it seems to be ever fresh because these principles of design, and I could go on and on, but that would be talking about my own work. But incidentally, since the pandemic, there's been a much greater interest in our work because of a few documentaries which came out covering some of our projects. And generally over the last 10 years, there is a more deeply felt need for knowing about our own traditions, because none of the schools teach anything about tradition, and tradition is one of the foundations for an architect's training. You may or may not be surprised that when the Villa Savoy was being built, Corbusier was saying that my only real master is the past. And then you see all the great modern architects. I mean, Kahn, you take Kahn, they knew their classical roots. So I think there's no architecture possible without studying architecture generally. And that is, in fact, our whole education should be about answering the question, what is architecture? We should be studying history, because the basic response to which architecture response doesn't change over time. You have to build in the context of a use, a function. You have to build in the context of a materiality, whatever is available or whatever is feasible, then climate, and then society, and then history, and then finally the message you want to give, the meaning aspect. So this, unfortunately, at least in our country, architecture is not taught like this, as you all know. I don't know about India or other places. So learning from history is an integral part, should be an integral part of an architect's training, because these are the questions which have always been there. And this is what makes a building, if it responds to these 6 contexts, in my view, that is when it's architecture. Otherwise, it's not. It's not keeping up to its responsibility. So that's my first. So because there's a greater feeling that we've lost something, I think our institute is, I think, offering a much needed platform in society, which we bring together the remaining carriers of tradition, which are in all fields, from philosophy to language to poetry, poetics. And there are people all, I mean, this is really I don't want to go on and on, but it is as if tradition has always been there, but it's become subaltern, quoting from post-colonial theory. It's there, but for us, so-called educated, it's disappeared. But anyway, so this is our philosophy generally. And I think about geometry, I mean, it's an ongoing research. You learn from the craftsman, but the classical methods, because of 100 years of this disconnect, craftsmen kept working in the small towns and this and that, and as contractors and masons in modern projects. But and you learn a lot from them, but we also learn equally from classical buildings, as I showed you one analysis. And it's been a many year-long, as Anisha knows, long journey which started at Prasada, and it continues today. Thank you.
So thank you, Taimur, and thank you, all of you. So continuing from what all of you have said, when I was seeing your presentations and when I'm hearing you talk now, there's this great sense of rediscovery that I sense you all experienced when you're working, and you still do. And as somebody who was seeing what you were doing, there's a great sense of rediscovery that I also got, which was very, very exciting. Now, the thing is that all of your work for each of you it stems from where you are. So whether it's your response to places of conflict in where you work in Afghanistan, or where Jharna is looking at Bandipur in a very, very specific context, or Dorji or Taimur. But I've noticed that something common that all of you are doing is that essentially you're questioning established protocols, whether they are ways of doing conservation or they're ways of generating interest or tourism or public participation. And so what I'm asking is that now these are very specific responses to your own context. Two questions. One is, do you think that this can be applied successfully to other places as well, which are not your context? In other words, what are the lessons that you think we can learn from here? And the second question is that in the context that you work in, how has your work influenced other architects' work? So let's say other ways of building or repair or conservation or architecture. So who'd like to go first?
Right? Okay. So I think, the conservation, the preservation world has an arbiter. It has this umbrella, which tends to be UNESCO and its charters and, its prescriptions of how to do things. And I think that's one way, certainly. And now more and more we see globally that there are countries that adhere to UNESCO's prescriptions because they get World Heritage Sites out of them and there are other things. But UNESCO's prescriptions also change over time because they need to become more flexible. They need to become less strict. So the notion of being strict and to what degree one is strict with, let's say, repair, especially historic monuments and maybe even contemporary architecture that has a certain value. To what level you're strict? Reconstruction, total preservation, which means that you don't change program, you don't change uses, you don't make it or you don't update it. That's one aspect that I would say for us in Afghanistan, by nature of where we are, we've been quite open about reinterpreting, about reimagining, and about reusing historic sites, particularly historic sites of a certain period. Now, we've also worked on an 8th century, late 8th century, early 9th century mosque, Abbasid era, and there we were very strict. And simply because the building was in a very, very dilapidated condition, we didn't want to do reconstruction, we didn't want to do an approach that would affect the quality of these amazing plaster decorative surfaces. Elsewhere, we've been quite open. I mean, perhaps as the projects I've showed today. So it ranges on the approach. And the second thing I would say is with respect to Afghanistan, we've really become a school outside of schools for many architects and many conservators, because the environment isn't conducive to architects to do that kind of work. I know elsewhere architects, particularly those that are able to, they study, they go abroad, they study abroad, they work a few years, then they come back into their context. Our architects aren't able to do that. So we have to bring those contexts or those discussions and those debates to them within the country. And I would say the last word on this is, how effective has that been? I would say that many of our architects are now working outside of our offices. Some have their own practices. Others have worked for government. They're in key positions in government where they are starting to make an impact. Yes.
Well, replicated, the Manipur model is very easily replicated. Well, that's what we think, but it hasn't really happened in Nepal as well. And for the reasons for that would be like many reasons, complicated reasons. But I would like to say, like, if any other place would like to, take on the approach, it would be like I showed in the, the example is the bazaar, the open space or the public space. If you can bring in external investment into the open spaces, the public spaces, the street, the squares, whatever, and upgrade the infrastructure as well, the buildings will take care of themselves. The houses, will take care of themselves.
So you're increasing stakeholders and visibility.
Yes,
both.
yes. And because like that example I showed, the bazaar was not a place to be in at all. Like, it was dusty, muddy. It was just like a highway street or some stop or something like that. So no one was there. But now when in the morning, you see the students walk by, in the evenings, they're all playing, and, it's a common space for tourists, the locals. It feels good to go back and see that. And so I think the investment should be more, if we could do that. The buildings, especially like little residences where people live, are changing and should change, continue to change. So so in terms of like the other part of your question was, in any other architects are following it up. Manipur is a very small town, and well, vernacular architecture wasn't designed by architects. So I think it's for Manipur, I think it's more important for the locals to realize what their buildings are, and for them what it means for them, and also the contractors to realize that. So they don't bring in architecture from somewhere else, like even Kathmandu or something else, and find inspiration within the bazaar itself. So we've worked with one contractor for more than like 10, 12 years now, and we've seen him, his vocabulary change as well. And at the beginning, he used to say like, no, it's not possible at all. But when, so many examples right there, and then now actually he is telling the owners like, oh, you should build in the Bandipur style.
So you've convinced him, so he's
Yes,
in turn
yes.
convincing other people.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
With my practice, when I started, I was the only architect. Now we have a lot of other architects. So I hope that we made a little bit of impact. One of the ways we tried very hard to make sure that it would continue was by trying to have the traditional architectural guidelines, and then whatever experience we had in terms of not just talking about the philosophical side, but the actual technical drawings and all, we put that together, and that is there in the ministry's website, Freefall, and that is something I've seen a lot of young architects and engineers using, so hopefully that's an impact. And for me, with regard to, as you said, keeping it strictly in terms of restoration, with a lot of my sites, I did struggle a little bit because they were Buddhist sites, and the Buddhist principle of impermanence was there, and then conservation is about permanence. And then I would have lots of conversations with monks who would say, this is not important, the practice is important, and I want a bigger temple because that is more important. So always that balance, and that I learned a lot about. In fact, I did my thesis and my master's on that, of the permanence and impermanence sites. And that was something where I struggled a bit. And I still see that. We still have a lot of sites where people would like to tear down the old 17th century temple and build a new one. So that's one of the ways, yes, my struggle with restoration. But in terms of learning, I myself, because when I joined, I was the only one and I had no mentors. When I went outside, whether it was to York or to Italy or Norway, I would say that I learned a lot from there. So this cross-cultural exchange, maybe now in Bhutan, because we have a lot of support from the government in most of our projects, and I don't see that in a lot of countries, that could be something where the government comes in. But when I say government, I mean the local government, not the central government, the local head, chief of the village and things like that. So that is
So the
something
community, in a
maybe,
sense.
yes, the way the communities would do things. That is something that maybe we can have a cross-cultural exchange on that. And with regard to local craftspeople, the students who've passed out from the Zurich Jusum traditional crafts schools, I see a lot of them actually working in India and even overseas, where people are building temples and they need people to do the paintings on the walls and then the traditional carvings. So yes, that is something
it
that
has
is
an
happening.
impact in
Yes.
many ways. And Taimur, I mean, how has your practice impacted other practices, perhaps in Pakistan, Lahore?
I mean, probably not much, but it's at least there is an interest, no doubt. And now because there are students also and their work, so it's a long process. And as I said, society at the moment has become aware of this also. It's such a juncture because of the rapid, senseless change which is happening in our cities, pure speculation. I mean, it's just destruction of heritage sites. It's just amazingly wild. And people as citizens are becoming quite concerned. So there is a growing pushback also from civil society. And then apart from this, the architecture schools are also showing greater interest in learning, at least as part of an architect's kit. Why shouldn't he know about geometry? I mean, it's senseless not to be trained properly. And then and through the tradition, learning how the process and the geometry is combined with the technique and technology of fabrication. And this, by the way, is something which is common beyond our region also. I mean, I was asked to give a workshop in Hong Kong, and the teachers there were having the same problems. They're so sort of cerebral and sort of just like lines on paper and now on computer screens, with no real sense of the concrete and so on. So it's a relevant issue, I think, for architectural schools across the world. And I've been to other places also. But within our region, Snehanshu, I just wanted to answer the first question about the relevance for our region. Our region has a lot of commonalities. And one of those is the impact of the colonial experience or this particular post-enlightenment worldview, which we get from our education. So that is something which is, I think, more important. A re-evaluation of where the world is going and what are the roots of where the world is going. And we need to go deeper than just the surface manifestations, both of tradition and of modernity, because these are just the tips of icebergs. The real thing is what you don't see. So this is a problem with our education also. It leaves out more than it really gives you. Sorry, you were going to say something.
No, it's just that I think we should open up the questions to the house as well as those on the internet, that is on the Zoom. And while we wait for the questions, I just want to, I mean, it's interesting that we thought we were talking about repairs and conservation, but we seem to have got into education and, you just name it, which means that this is a field which I think when we hear more in the second session is going to establish that this is a field which is the elephant in the room. Nobody is talking about it, but it's a field that we all as architects and otherwise also need to get into. So while we wait for the questions, I just want to make these remarks and please put up your hands and give your names when you ask the question. Yeah.
Sensei Raj from Vision India 2032. I've just come back from Sikkim, where we have the gargantuan task of rebuilding not only the houses, but also the entire, the design of the settlements. So we've been talking to several different ministries and stakeholders, of course. But listening to you all talking about it, especially Taimur suggested that geography should also be included in the core disciplines. Should we take a systems approach to even architecture as well? Because architecture is not merely about the buildings and the structures, but it encompasses everything that we live. I think my esteemed presenter from Bhutan would agree that balance is the key, the harmony is the key, the responsibility or responsible evolution is the key. I'll shut up there. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anybody like to respond to that, or was that just an observation? Yeah. Maybe we can take some more questions and try to answer them as a comprehensive thing.
Thank you. I would still like to interrogate the term repair much more. Rahul has coined this for the seminar, and I think all of you have kind of agreed to the term. And is it when we use the word repair, are we trying to make a larger case for how we do stuff of conservation in South Asia? When we use the word repair, is it a kind of a implicit critique of the way conservation is practiced, or the tensions in conservation? There's this big thing about authenticity or the Eurocentric view. And I would love to hear from you. I'm sure Rahul can answer that, but you all embrace this term, right? And I don't think you'll change your visiting card tomorrow and call yourself repair architects. You still go out, call yourself conservation architect.
That's a
So,
thought.
yeah. So I was just, I mean, it's a low, I mean, we should kind of deconstruct this term a lot more.
Sure. Any other?
I
or-
think perhaps a hyphen was missing, hyphen
Sorry,
pair.
please identify yourself as well.
I'm Nurul Karim. I'm an architect from Mumbai, and perhaps a hyphen was missing, a hyphen pair, and perhaps the pairing of cultural development along with socioeconomic development. You know, perhaps that's another way of looking at it. Yeah.
Sure, it's getting more and more interesting. There's Amrish there who's got a question.
So Pratyush, to pick up, I just want to pick up on what you said. Actually, I am very excited about the possibility of starting an office of repair and rehabilitation after this conference. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are people who pick that up and become practitioners of repair and rehabilitation. But on a different note, it's just a matter of syntax and something, it's more a comment than a question, is the use of the word tradition and modernity as binaries. And in countries like us in South Asia, actually, I should refrain from using the word countries. It is a continuum that we seek to create. And I think that's what everyone is talking about, is what do we learn from the past? And there is a living heritage that we all have access to. And what part of the living heritage is relevant for contemporary lifestyle? And I think when we begin to answer questions of what is valuable today, then we begin to move away from nostalgia and conservation for the sake of conservation, which Dorji pointed out, like if a monastery is for meditation and we've got more monks, then is it important to retain the idea of the old, or should we reinvent? Yeah, I just wanted to point that out.
So just to highlight, sorry, Chitra, just to highlight one issue that you raised about the binary. So Taimur made a point, where in his presentation, he said that you can't go back to the past, but you can look at the past to build for now. I mean, I'm sort of paraphrasing what he said. Maybe Taimur should correct me if I've said something incorrect over here. But I just wanted to highlight. Yes, Chitra,
Yeah,
please.
so in the same vein, why not use the word retrofit than repair?
Sure.
And also what
Actually,
Joshi thinks. Yeah.
Sorry, I just passed the mic to you. But one of the things that I sort of wanted to say in between was that it was very interesting that both in the case of Bhutan and Afghanistan, for various reasons, geographical as well as political, they have to work with what's available there. You know, largely, not flown in, if you know what I mean. I mean, that was the point that Ajmal made, that, you know, that we have to, all the components are being made on site, practically on site. And that is how it was in the past. Whereas in places like Nepal or in India and even in Pakistan, you can pretty much build with anything you choose. There's no restriction really. And that is where I think this whole point that Mr. Dixit was making yesterday of the sameness of things come in, you know. It's good. And then the next point I want to make about this again has been actually culled out of what has been said, is that when you design a new building, do you make it into something like, I think Jharna said that, you know, that this person told you that make it such that I never have to repair it, or at least for one entire generation. I think that's the trouble. If you are able to design buildings that you repair as a matter of course, as a part of your life, not necessarily as, oh God, now I have to repair this damn thing, you know. So if you were to make buildings like that, which RCC doesn't allow, really speaking, I mean, all of us understand that, all of us have worked with RCC. So this is the point that I just want to make, but sorry for taking the mic away. And any internet questions?
Here. I have a question.
Yeah.
Again,
Maybe there's a question.
it's about the term repair. And in the morning, we talked about the intangibles. And what we saw right now basically was physical repair, right? But there's a term repair can also extend beyond the physical. And the question is, what is it that it takes on itself as a responsibility of that which is not physical?
So in other words, what we are trying to question here and sort of place is, how do we see repair? And I think those questions of retrofitting rather than repair, or, you know, repair not being sort of attractive enough, nobody wanting to call themselves a repair professional, that calls into question all these things. So if you'd like to comment.
Maybe in order, briefly, I think the terminology is specific and sometimes vague, and sometimes it refers only to certain things. I think certainly what I've seen presented in this session has to do with existing architecture, has to do with monuments, has to do with historic environments. I think that's what we've all pretty much spoke about. But the wider definition of repair, I think essentially means what we have today, we keep, we maintain, we use for longer. And I think they say necessity is the mother of invention. Perhaps invention is not the right word, but the necessity is the mother of repair. If you need it, if you can't afford to move out, if you can't afford to rebuild or build anew, then you repair. Of course, it's not the world we lived in 100 years ago. There's a much bigger demographics, populations grow, people want to live in different ways. And I don't have the statistics, and I'm not sure even those statistics exist, of what percentage of the world lives in, say, monuments, or what we would classify as heritage environments. I think it's very little. The vast majority live in other areas. So perhaps it requires a change in the mindset of how we build, because right now we build things that don't last. I mean, that's important, and perhaps there, Taimur would like to say something, because permanence initially would require more cost, but then less repair costs, and perhaps not the need to reconstruct. So I think all of those would need to be considered, at least from my perspective. And I think it's a very, very wide discussion.
For Taimur to say something. I think you have your moment here.
We have to.
Sorry.
Are there any Zoom questions? No.
I'm Ojit. I'm teaching zoology, but I'm a student of restoration ecology. What I want to ask here is, my subject, from where I come from, tells me that there are three important factors that mark this Anthropocene. For example, the loss of biodiversity, loss of hills and mountains and lakes. Another one is the pollutions and the climate change. The third one is a migration. So to all of you, what I really want to ask is, in the case of the construction of the buildings for the migrants, or the people who are migrated to a particular place and come back, at that particular point of time, as an architect, what would be your priority? When we talk about conservation, you talk about restoration, you talk about repairing, or you talk about reconstruction. So when I come back to my own original place, I would like to see my buildings, my house, so at this particular context, what would be your priority? In the whole context of this migration, it can be internal or it can be transnational. So thank you.
Yeah. We'll mull on it, I think.
Please repeat the question. I'm sorry to do that. Yeah.
So, Taimur or Jharna?
Repair, like to expand a little bit more on repair, like when Rahul first suggested it, and it made me think about it as well. And the most important thing now is, I think, with that example, the work we're doing right now, where the owner's brief was like, make it so that his son doesn't have to do any more work, is and also coming to the difference between modern and traditional, is the common belief now, I think, is that the modern structures do not need any maintenance, and traditionals are high maintenance. But then again, well, in Kathmandu, we had a very strong practice of maintenance that we have totally, forgotten. There's a day once a year, just before monsoon, where we are supposed to clean all the water spouts and the gutters, drainage, everything. So like once monsoon comes, all the gutters are cleaned and it protects the building. You've kind of forgotten that. And then every year during festivals, we paint, we keep open up the houses. We've forgotten that as well. Now, and then when during like a little bigger celebrations, like a birth of someone or weddings of someone, used to paint the house, you do all your repairs. Now we go out and do all these festive celebrations in hotels and resorts.
Yeah.
So the concept of house has changed, and I think for me, what repair is versus like conservation was, I was more thinking more about these everyday architecture where we need to like constantly maintain it. If even like the 2015 Nepal earthquake, I think it was more the issue of maintenance than the earthquake.
Yeah.
Bringing them.
So if I might quickly draw something out from what you said, what I understand is that repair was like an act of celebration almost earlier, and now it's like an act of necessity. I mean, you have no choice, you repair, where earlier on you celebrated as you repair,
Yes.
or you repair was
Yeah.
part of a celebration, which was what we did here as well. Diwali, Holi, all of that meant that. So I think those are important things to think about when we are thinking of ways of making repair more attractive, because that's also one of the things that I think.
So I think we are also running out of time. Yeah.
Yes.
Just before, yeah. Have there been any strategies for preventive maintenance? Microphone.
Have there been any strategies for preventive maintenance? For example, if you look at the monuments of Petra, you're trying to reduce the erosion over time through preventive maintenance strategies. And the question is, when do you actually come in? Do you come in later, or do you start analyzing and accessing this sort of aging process?
I think,
and is there this sort of shift of paradigm where reverse aging is concerned as well?
well, I'm going to answer this rather than the experts. I'm not a conservation architect, unlike the others who are sitting here. I would answer it this way, that it depends on what you choose to use as your material for construction. So I've been hearing again and again that this whole idea that you use modern materials and you are spared the amount of repair you need to do, that's not actually true. The repair comes later, and when it comes, it becomes almost unrepairable.
We're talking about historic conservation, heritage historic conservation.
Well,
For that, then
section before
yeah.
about what do you consider was conserving?
So I think we'll have to discuss this during the tea break, because we have run out of time. I can see
we
Rahul
can't.
standing right there. So I want to thank Taimur, especially since he's not here. But thanks everybody, and
Yeah,
we call
so
it a day.
no, thank you for this panel, and Anisha and Snehanshu. This has been a really good discussion, and considering everyone sort of was looking at me for having dropped this word repair, I must clarify. No, I mean, I think, it was interesting when I spoke to every one of these panelists, as I did with everyone. When I mentioned repair, everyone felt very liberated that we weren't talking conservation because of the charters and the norms and things. And, I mean, it is a much more robust sort of category. And I think, Nuru, you said hyphenated, and I've been thinking about that. It is really about repairing. Right? So you repair with other things, you repair with new materials, you repair with new protocols through festivals. I mean, rhythms that we have lost, where that intangible and the tangible come together, and where time begins to play a different role, right? So how does one embed the imagination of time? And I think we luckily have another whole panel around this question. So I'm sure it will extend into kind of a more nuanced discussion, I hope. But repairing, I think the hyphenation might be one way to imagine it and to open it up. So thanks. And we've got a good 15 or 20 minutes for tea, and then we'll come back for the last session. Thank you.